When CEO Amelia Langford pointed at the hairline crack along the private jet's fuselage and coldly ordered, "Tape it and fly," the hangar went silent. Mason Carter, a single father working as a contract technician, stared at the roll of silver tape in the manager's hand, then at the thick contract waiting for his signature. He understood the choice before anyone spoke it aloud. Sign, and he would lose his conscience. Refuse, and he would lose everything he had left. Mason tore the contract in half before her and dialed the FAA. That call would not only ground the plane. If you want to know why one phone call shattered an aviation empire, stay with this story until the end. The private hangar belonging to Langford Aviation sat at the edge of a quiet stretch of tarmac outside Dallas, guarded from the rest of the airfield by tall steel doors and a reputation for discretion. Inside, under banks of white light, a jet worth tens of millions of dollars waited on its wheels, while a small crew moved around it with the practiced urgency of people running out of time. The plane was scheduled to leave for New York within the hour, carrying the one person whose signature could still save a merger that was quietly falling apart behind closed boardroom doors. Amelia Langford stood near the nose of the aircraft with her phone pressed to her ear, listening to an investor's assistant explain, again, that the window for a face-to-face meeting was closing fast. She was young for a chief executive, sharp in a way that made people underestimate how tired she was, and she carried the entire weight of her father's company on a frame that had not slept properly in a week. The merger was not a luxury. Without it, half the fleet would be grounded by winter and hundreds of jobs would disappear with it. Mason Carter arrived through the side entrance carrying his own tool case, called in at the last minute because the regular maintenance crew was short 2 technicians and the flight could not be pushed back. He had built a quiet reputation as a contract technician who did not cut corners, the kind of man other crews requested when something needed to be right rather than fast. He walked the length of the fuselage the way he always did, hand trailing lightly along the metal, eyes moving in slow, deliberate sweeps. It was near the frame of the forward cabin door that his hand stopped. A hairline crack ran along a seam in the skin of the aircraft, thin enough that a rushed inspector might have missed it, but unmistakable once found. Worse, faint tool marks around the edges suggested the area had been handled before, patched or smoothed over rather than properly repaired. Mason crouched lower, running his fingers along the metal, feeling for the give that should not have been there. He called over Logan Reed, the director of operations, who arrived already frowning at his watch rather than at the plane. Logan glanced at the crack for barely 3 seconds before waving a hand through the air, insisting it was a surface blemish, nothing that would affect the integrity of the airframe. Mason disagreed. He said plainly that a crack near a pressurized cabin door needed a full inspection before anyone climbed aboard, let alone before the jet climbed to altitude. That was when Amelia stepped away from her call, her patience already worn thin by hours of negotiation, and demanded to know what was holding up her flight. Logan answered before Mason could, calling it a minor cosmetic issue that the technician was overstating. Amelia's eyes moved from Logan to Mason and back again, and something in her expression made clear she had already decided which answer she preferred to believe, whether or not it was the true one. Mason told her plainly that he could not sign off on the aircraft's safety without further inspection, not with damage in that location and not with a repair history that did not match what he was seeing with his own eyes. Amelia's jaw tightened. She told him he had exactly 1 hour before the plane needed to be in the air, and that whatever paperwork needed signing had better be ready by then, because the deal waiting in New York would not wait for a technician's caution. Mason did not answer right away. He looked at the contract folder tucked under Logan's arm, then back at the crack still visible in the metal beneath the hangar lights, and made the only decision that made sense to him. Instead of nodding along, he asked for more time and better equipment to check how deep the damage actually ran, choosing the slower, harder path over the one that would have ended the conversation in his favor within seconds. The rest of the crew went about their work in careful silence, none of them willing to be caught watching the standoff too closely. A young apprentice near the tail section pretended to check a panel he had already inspected twice, straining to hear how the conversation would end without appearing to listen at all. Everyone in that hangar understood, on some level, that whatever happened next would decide far more than whether one aircraft left on schedule. Mason had not always been a contract technician moving from hangar to hangar for whoever would hire him. Years earlier, he had held a steady position at a larger carrier, respected for his precision, until he raised concerns about a maintenance shortcut that management wanted quietly buried. The report he filed was accurate, but it cost him his position and, for a long stretch afterward, his standing in an industry that remembered whistleblowers longer than it remembered the problems they exposed. Since then, he had rebuilt his career one contract at a time, careful, thorough, and mostly invisible. He was raising a child on his own now, a fact that shaped every decision he made without ever needing to be spoken aloud in the hangar that afternoon. It showed only in the quiet math behind his eyes when Logan mentioned money, in the brief flicker of hesitation before he answered honestly instead of conveniently. Mason was not a man who enjoyed conflict. He simply understood, in a way few people in that hangar seemed to, that a wrong signature on a maintenance form could turn into a call nobody wanted to make to a family somewhere. Logan tried a different approach once the argument stalled, pulling Mason aside near the wing and mentioning, almost casually, that there was a discretionary bonus available for technicians who helped keep operations moving during tight schedules like this one. Mason understood exactly what was being offered and what it was meant to buy. He said nothing in response beyond asking, again, for permission to run a proper diagnostic scan before anyone touched a pen to paperwork. While Logan worked to smooth things over with Amelia, Mason quietly pulled up the aircraft's maintenance log on a tablet handed to him by a junior crew member. Several of the recent entries looked wrong the moment he studied them closely. Timestamps for inspections were spaced too close together to be realistic, work descriptions were vague where they should have been specific, and one signature block matched a technician's name that Mason recognized from years earlier, someone who was no longer working in the industry at all. Amelia, still juggling calls from her investor's office, had no visibility into any of this. To her, the man standing at the nose of her aircraft was simply an obstacle between her and a boardroom in New York, a hired hand whose job was maintenance, not judgment calls about her merger. She reminded him not unkindly but firmly that his contract carried a penalty clause for delays that could not be justified by documented mechanical failure. Mason asked once more if the company would authorize a specialized inspection tool that could measure the true depth of the crack rather than relying on a visual check alone. Before Amelia could respond, Logan cut in, insisting the internal team had already cleared the aircraft days earlier and that further testing was an unnecessary use of time they did not have. His voice carried the practiced confidence of a man used to being believed without being questioned. The tension in the hangar rose another notch when an assistant hurried over carrying a fresh roll for repair tape, alongside a folder of paperwork that only needed a signature to certify the jet as fit to fly. Mason looked at the tape, then at the folder, understanding with sudden clarity that whatever was happening here was not a simple oversight or a rushed judgment call under pressure. It had the shape of something planned, something that had been done quietly before and was meant to be done quietly again. He thought, briefly, of the calls he would have to make if he refused, the bills waiting on his kitchen table, the quiet stretch of weeks without steady work that always followed a broken contract in an industry this small. None of it changed what his hands already knew from years of running them over metal that had failed before it should have. Some decisions were not really decisions at all, once a person understood what they were looking at. Amelia's patience finally broke as her phone buzzed again with another message from the investor's office, each one shorter and colder than the last. In her mind, every minute the jet sat grounded was a minute closer to watching a deal that could save half her company's fleet slip away entirely. She believed, because Logan kept telling her so, that the crack Mason had found was minor, cosmetic, and being used as leverage by a contractor looking to extract more money or more attention than he deserved. Logan stood at her shoulder the entire time, feeding her only what supported the outcome he wanted, framing Mason as a hired technician exaggerating a small problem to justify a bigger invoice. He knew exactly which words would land with a CEO running on no sleep and mounting panic, and he chose them carefully, repeating that the internal team had signed off days earlier and that further delay had nothing to do with safety. In front of the flight crew, the company's attorney, and the rest of the maintenance team gathered near the wing, Amelia finally gave the order everyone in that hangar would remember for years afterward. Her voice was flat, controlled, and utterly certain of itself when she said it. Tape it and fly. 4 words spoken like a solution rather than a risk, and every person standing within earshot understood instantly that something had shifted in the room. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Even Logan, who had pushed for exactly this outcome, seemed briefly unsettled by hearing it said aloud in front of witnesses rather than suggested quietly behind closed doors. The silence stretched long enough that Amelia herself seemed to register, just for a second, How the words sounded once they left her mouth and hung in the cold hangar air. Mason asked her one final time, plainly and without anger, whether she truly wanted him to certify that aircraft as safe to fly in its current condition. It was not a challenge meant to embarrass her. It was a last door left open, one final chance for someone with the authority to change course before anything became irreversible. Amelia did not take it. Instead, she pushed the folder toward him across the narrow table beside the aircraft, telling him that if he refused to sign, he could consider his relationship with every hangar under the Langford name finished, effective immediately. She meant it as leverage, the kind of ultimatum that had worked on people before, a clean trade of compliance for continued employment. Mason picked up the folder, looked at it for a long moment, and then tore it cleanly in half in front of her, in front of Logan, in front of the flight crew and the attorney, and everyone else who would later be asked to describe what happened in that hangar. He told her, in a voice far calmer than the moment seemed to call for, that he did not sign his name to a coffin with wings, no matter what number was printed on the contract. Logan reacted first, snapping at a nearby guard to remove Mason from the property, while Amelia, furious and humiliated in front of her own people, ordered him out without another word. As two guards moved to escort him toward the exit, Mason pulled out his phone, dialed the safety reporting line he had used only once before in his career, and calmly requested that the Federal Aviation Administration be notified immediately that an aircraft was being pressured into flight with unverified structural damage. His voice did not shake as he spoke, even as the guards tightened their grip on his arms and the hangar doors loomed closer with every step. He gave the dispatcher his name without hesitation, understanding fully that whatever came next, a lawsuit, blacklisting, financial ruin, none of it would matter as much as the simple fact that he had refused to let a lie leave the ground with people's lives strapped inside it. Mason stood outside the main gate of the hangar, held loosely by a guard who seemed unsure whether he was actually supposed to detain a man calmly making a phone call rather than fleeing the scene of anything. He gave the dispatcher every detail he could think of, the aircraft's registration number, the exact location of the crack, the name of the company, and a clear description of the pressure he had been placed under to sign off on a flight he believed was unsafe. Inside the hangar, Amelia's first instinct was to treat the entire episode as an act of retaliation from a contractor angry about losing his position. That interpretation was convenient, and Logan did nothing to complicate it, urging her instead to move forward quickly with an internal sign-off so the jet could still make its window to New York before the situation grew any more complicated than it already was. David Brooks, the lead pilot scheduled to fly that afternoon, had overheard enough of the argument through the open cockpit door to feel a knot forming in his stomach that had nothing to do with turbulence. He had flown for the company for years and trusted its maintenance program without question. But something about the tone of the argument he had just witnessed made him hesitate before completing his own pre-flight checklist with his usual confidence. The call Mason placed did not disappear into a queue somewhere. Within a short time, the airport authority contacted the hangar directly, informing Langford Aviation that the flight was to remain grounded until an inspection could be completed and the relevant maintenance records reviewed. Amelia read the message twice before the reality of it fully landed, her anger at Mason curdling instantly into something closer to disbelief. Logan pushed harder now, insisting they still had options, that an internal certification signed by anyone with the proper credentials could satisfy the paperwork requirement, while the real inspection dragged on separately. Amelia, rattled and unwilling to lose the entire day, allowed herself to consider it for a moment longer than she should have, caught between the fear of losing her merger and the growing unease that something about this situation had already slipped outside her control. An inspector named Evelyn Harper arrived at the hangar not long afterward, moving with the unhurried authority of someone who had seen every version of this scene before and was not interested in being rushed by anyone's schedule. She requested that the affected section of the aircraft be sealed off from further work and that the full maintenance log, along with any related repair documentation, be handed over immediately for review. Mason was called back inside, though not as an employee this time. Evelyn wanted him present as the person who had raised the initial report, the one whose account of the crack and the pressure surrounding it would matter most to the investigation now underway. The reversal in the room was almost physical. The man who had been marched out under guard less than an hour earlier was suddenly the most important witness standing inside that hangar. Amelia remained outwardly composed, arms crossed, expression unreadable, But something in her had begun to shift as she watched Evelyn move methodically toward the exact spot on the fuselage that Mason had flagged from the very beginning. A small, unwelcome thought had started forming somewhere beneath her anger, one she was not yet ready to say aloud to anyone standing near her. David lingered near the cockpit door, watching the inspector work with a growing sense of relief he had not expected to feel. He had spent years trusting the company's maintenance program without question, and some part of him understood that if Mason had not made that call, he might have flown that jet himself without ever knowing what was hidden beneath the fresh paint along its skin. Evelyn's inspection of the fuselage did not take long to confirm what Mason had already suspected. The crack ran deeper than the original report suggested, extending further beneath the surface than a simple visual check could have revealed, and it sat close enough to the pressurized cabin structure that flying at altitude carried real, measurable risk rather than theoretical concern. The silver tape sitting nearby in its plastic wrapping would have done nothing to address a problem of that scale. Mason pointed out several smaller details that only someone who worked with his hands every day would have noticed. A section of paint looked slightly fresher than the metal around it, applied recently enough to still catch the light differently. The rivets used in one section did not match the specification called for in that part of the airframe. The repair documentation on file was missing the before and after photographs that should have accompanied any legitimate structural work. Logan's composure began to fray as the details piled up, and he kept interrupting to steer the conversation back toward Mason's supposed motives, suggesting repeatedly that a disgruntled contractor was manufacturing a crisis out of a routine cosmetic fix. Amelia, for the first time since the argument began, turned the question directly toward Logan instead, asking plainly why the internal paperwork failed to document the true extent of the damage in the first place. Logan's answer came out vague and rehearsed. Something about the maintenance team following standard company procedure for minor repairs. It did not satisfy Evelyn, who asked for a complete list of every aircraft Logan had personally signed off on for maintenance over the past 6 months, a request that visibly unsettled him in a way none of Amelia's earlier questions had managed to do. Mason began to understand that what had started as a single dangerous decision about a single aircraft might be only the visible edge of something considerably larger. A young technician named Ryan Miller found a quiet moment to approach him near the tool cabinets and admitted, in a low voice, that several people on the team had been pressured to sign similar paperwork before, but nobody had been willing to risk their job by refusing the way Mason had. Amelia stood apart from the group for a moment, caught between the pride that had carried her through years of difficult decisions and a colder, more uncomfortable feeling that the person she had trusted most inside her own operation might have been deceiving her for far longer than one rushed afternoon. She said nothing yet, but her eyes kept returning to Logan every time he spoke. By the end of the inspection, Evelyn had seen enough to make her position clear without any ambiguity left in it. The aircraft would not be cleared to fly under any circumstances until the full investigation into its maintenance history was complete, and that included every document, every signature, and every technician whose name appeared anywhere in its recent repair records. She photographed the crack from multiple angles, labeled samples of the tape and the mismatched rivets, and sealed the section of fuselage with tamper-evident markers before anyone else could approach it. Mason watched the process quietly, aware that whatever he had started in that hangar could no longer be undone by an apology or a quiet settlement offered behind closed doors. The evidence now belonged to the investigation, not to the company that had tried to bury it. Logan lingered near the tail of the jet, watching the seals go up with the stiff expression of a man calculating how much of this he could still contain before it spread beyond the hangar walls. He had managed difficult situations before, buried them under paperwork and confident phrasing, but there was no smoothing over sealed evidence photographed and logged by a federal inspector standing 3 feet away from him. The merger meeting in New York collapsed within days, and news outlets began reporting that Langford Aviation was under an emergency review by federal regulators. Amelia, watching her company's name attached to headlines she never imagined writing, convinced herself for a while that Mason's single decision in that hangar had cost her hundreds of millions of dollars over what she still wanted to believe was an overcautious judgment call. She authorized her legal team to send Mason formal notice of a lawsuit, citing breach of contract, damage to the company's reputation, and unauthorized disclosure of internal information to a federal agency. It was an aggressive move, designed as much to intimidate as to recover damages, and it landed on Mason's kitchen table at a time when he had almost no resources to fight back against a company with unlimited legal budget. He did not have money for a major law firm, but he had something the lawsuit could not easily erase. He had kept every technical note he took that day, along with photographs of the crack, timestamps from his own equipment, and a record of text messages showing exactly how hard he had been pushed to sign paperwork he believed was false. None of it was dramatic. All of it was precise, and precision was the one thing Logan's team had never expected him to have. Catherine Vale, an independent attorney who had spent years working aviation cases before going out on her own, agreed to represent Mason after reviewing what he had gathered. She told him plainly that this was no longer a simple contract dispute. It had the clear shape of retaliation against someone who had reported a legitimate safety concern, and federal protections existed specifically for situations exactly like his. Amelia, meanwhile, found herself facing pressure from her own board of directors, who wanted a visible resolution that would calm investors and reassure the public that the company had already dealt with whoever was responsible. Logan seized the opening, quietly suggesting to board members that framing Mason as a financially motivated saboteur would resolve the story neatly without requiring anyone else to answer difficult questions. But Evelyn's investigation kept turning up details that made that narrative harder to sustain. She found a signature on one of the newer maintenance records belonging to a technician who had left the company entirely more than a year earlier, someone who no longer worked anywhere in the industry. Mason recognized the name immediately. It belonged to a man who had once warned him privately about falsified inspection reports before disappearing from the field without much explanation. What had begun as a personal standoff between a CEO and a contractor was quietly becoming something much larger, an investigation into a pattern of maintenance corruption that reached well beyond a single aircraft or a single afternoon. Amelia, unsettled by what she was starting to suspect, began reviewing hangar security footage, internal messages, and Logan's approval history late at night, alone, without telling anyone what she was looking for. Some nights she found nothing more than routine paperwork, but other entries left her staring at her screen long after midnight, comparing dates and signatures until the pattern became impossible to ignore. She had trusted Logan with the daily operations of a company her own father built, and the growing possibility that he had used that trust against her, and against the people flying on her aircraft, left her with a hollow, sleepless kind of anger she had not expected to feel towards someone she once considered family. Amelia eventually uncovered what Logan had been hiding for longer than she wanted to admit. He had quietly reduced maintenance spending across several aircraft over recent months, shifting the savings into figures that made the company's financial reports look stronger ahead of the merger negotiations. Every cut had been justified in his internal notes as standard cost efficiency, and every one of them had been approved with her signature on documents she trusted him to prepare honestly. She realized, with a slow and sickening clarity, that Logan had maneuvered her into giving that order in the hangar almost on purpose, positioning her to be the public face of a decision that would become indefensible the moment anyone looked closely at what had actually happened. If the crisis ever became public, she would be the executive who said the words, while he remained the operations director, simply following her instructions. Evelyn shared a portion of the investigation's non-confidential findings with Mason directly, since his original report had opened the door to it. At least 3 other aircraft carried maintenance files with similarly incomplete inspection records, missing documentation, or repairs that appeared rushed in ways that matched the pattern found on the jet from that afternoon. It was no longer possible to describe the situation as an isolated mistake. The pattern went further than paperwork. A junior pilot who had once refused to fly an aircraft with unresolved mechanical concerns had been quietly reassigned to a far less desirable route. A technician who raised similar objections before Mason had eventually been pressured into resigning. An outside contractor who asked too many pointed questions had simply stopped receiving work orders from the company without explanation. Amelia understood, finally, that Mason had not sabotaged her company that afternoon in the hangar. He had stopped her from putting her own signature on a disaster that would have destroyed far more than a merger. The realization did not arrive as relief. It arrived as shame, sharp and immediate, at how easily she had been willing to sacrifice a stranger's judgment rather than question the man she had trusted for years. She went to find Mason herself, without her legal team, without Logan, without an assistant trailing behind her with a phone in hand. She found him at the small workshop he used between contracts, tools laid out with the same careful order he brought to everything else he touched. He did not soften the moment for her comfort. He told her the part that hurt him most was not losing the contract or the money attached to it, but watching her treat a human life as a line item to be managed. Amelia had no ready response to that, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she found herself standing in a conversation she could not win through authority or leverage. She admitted, quietly and without excuses, that she had chosen to trust Logan over the man standing in front of a real aircraft with real damage, and that the mistake belonged entirely to her. Mason agreed to provide additional evidence for the investigation, but made clear he had no interest in returning to work for a company that only wanted to protect its reputation rather than the people who depended on it. Before she left the workshop, Amelia asked him one final question, almost hesitant in a way that did not match the woman who had given orders in that hangar weeks earlier. She wanted to know what would actually change his mind about an industry that had already cost him so much once before. Mason did not answer immediately. He simply told her that trust was rebuilt through action taken when nobody was watching, not through statements delivered when the cameras finally arrived. The Federal Aviation Administration convened a formal technical hearing with Amelia, Logan, Mason, Evelyn, attorney Catherine Vale, and a representative from the company's board of directors, all present in the same room. The atmosphere carried none of the informality of the hangar where this had all started. Every word spoken here would become part of a permanent record, and everyone in the room understood exactly how much weight that carried. Logan opened by trying to construct the same narrative he had leaned on from the beginning, describing Mason as a disgruntled contract technician who lacked the authority to make sweeping judgments about aircraft readiness and who did not understand the operational pressures involved in running a company at this scale. His tone was practiced, confident, the voice of a man who had talked his way out of difficult rooms many times before. Catherine answered with a sequence of evidence that Logan clearly had not expected to see assembled in one place. Photographs of the crack, text messages showing the pressure applied to sign off on the aircraft, the altered maintenance log, the mismatched signature belonging to a technician who no longer worked in the industry, and testimony from Ryan Miller describing a pattern of similar pressure applied to other employees over time. Mason was asked directly to explain why he had been so certain the aircraft should not fly. He answered without theatrics, laying out the reasoning step by step. When there was genuine doubt about damage near a structure meant to hold pressure at altitude, no amount of tape or paperwork could substitute for a full inspection, and no technician should ever be asked to turn a temporary patch into a permanent certification. Amelia listened to every word, and something in Mason's calm, unhurried explanations struck her as more credible than any polished report Logan had ever handed her across a boardroom table. She found herself comparing, almost involuntarily, the steadiness in his voice now to the confident reassurances Logan had offered her for years, reassurances she was beginning to understand had rarely matched the truth underneath them. Logan's composure cracked entirely when Evelyn produced hangar camera footage showing him directing a staff member to replace photographs in a maintenance file before investigators arrived on site. The board representative turned toward Amelia and asked her, in front of everyone, to explain exactly why the order to tape the aircraft and fly it had been given in the first place. Amelia rose from her seat and, for the first time since the crisis began, took full responsibility for the words she had spoken that afternoon, without deflecting blame or softening the account. She also stated clearly on the record that Logan had manipulated data, concealed known risks, and positioned her to bear the public consequences of decisions built on information he had deliberately withheld from her. It was the first moment in the entire ordeal where her accountability and her honesty arrived at the same time, in front of the very system meant to judge both. The room went quiet in a different way than it had in the hangar weeks earlier. This silence was not fear of an order being given. It was the sound of a company's leadership finally being separated in front of witnesses, one part choosing truth and the other still clinging to a story that no longer held together under scrutiny. Logan's attorney leaned toward him and whispered something urgent, but there was little left to argue once the footage had already played for everyone in the room to see. Even as the truth slowly came out, Mason found himself avoided by companies that might otherwise have hired him, none of them eager to bring on a technician known for calling federal regulators on a major client. Work dried up faster than he expected, and he began selling equipment from his own workshop just to keep up with ordinary expenses, all without ever considering taking back a single word of what he had told investigators. Amelia faced consequences of her own that no apology could soften. The company's stock dropped sharply, board members openly discussed replacing her as chief executive, and news coverage settled on a simple, damaging version of events, describing her as the executive who nearly let a dangerous aircraft take off rather than delay a business deal. Rather than hiring a public relations team to reshape the story in her favor, Amelia made a different choice. She announced an independent inspection of the company's entire fleet and suspended every flight that was not considered essential until the review was complete, a decision that cost the company money it could not easily spare during an already difficult quarter. She wrote and released a public letter addressed to her flight crews, her technicians, and her investors, admitting plainly that a culture built on fear had allowed safety to slip beneath profit for longer than anyone wanted to acknowledge. It was not a polished statement written by someone else on her behalf. People close to the company noted that it read like something she had written herself, late at night, without an editor softening the harder sentences. Logan was suspended immediately and later became the subject of a formal investigation into falsified records and the pressure he had placed on technical staff over an extended period. Former employees who had been afraid to speak earlier began coming forward once they saw that the company's leadership was finally willing to hear them. Evelyn found a private moment to tell Mason something he had not fully considered amid everything else happening around him. His single phone call had likely prevented a much larger chain of failures across several aircraft, not just the one grounded that afternoon in the hangar. It was a quiet acknowledgement, but it mattered more to him than any public recognition could have. Mason kept his distance from Amelia during this period, wary of becoming a symbol the company could use to polish its damaged image rather than someone whose concerns had actually been heard. Amelia understood, slowly and without resentment, that earning back any real respect from him would require repairing the entire system underneath her company, not simply repairing how she appeared to the outside world. Some nights she drove past his workshop without stopping, unsure whether showing up again would look like genuine change or simply another attempt to manage a difficult story. She had spent years learning how to win arguments, close deals, and steady a boardroom under pressure, but none of those skills told her how to rebuild trust with a man who had already watched her choose convenience over caution once before. For the first time in her career, she was willing to wait, to prove something through action instead of asking to be believed on her word alone. Ryan Miller, once too afraid to speak up, found himself testifying voluntarily before an internal review panel, describing the pressure he and others had faced long before Mason ever set foot in that hangar. His account, once he finally trusted that someone would listen, added weight to an investigation that had already grown far beyond a single crack in a single aircraft. Months later, Langford Aviation had worked its way through the worst of the crisis by overhauling its entire maintenance approval process, bringing in independent auditors, and establishing a formal right for technicians to refuse to certify a flight without fear of retaliation. It was a slower, more expensive way to run an airline, but it was the only version of the business Amelia was still willing to defend in front of her own board. She offered Mason a newly created position as Chief Safety Advisor for the revised program, with one condition written directly into the offer that mattered more than the title itself. Nobody within the company, including the chief executive, would ever again have the authority to pressure a technician into signing off on something against their professional judgment. Mason turned her down the first time she offered, unwilling to be treated as a symbol bought with a fancy title after everything that had happened. Amelia did not argue with him. Instead, she returned with a different kind of contract entirely, one that placed the authority to ground a flight squarely with the technical team rather than with her office or with anyone above them. Reading through the terms, Mason understood this was no longer an offer meant to buy his silence. It was a genuine opportunity to protect people who had never had a real voice inside that company before. He accepted, but only on the condition that Ryan Miller and the other technicians who had been quietly pushed out earlier be reinstated to their former positions with full back pay. At the internal announcement introducing the new safety program, Amelia deliberately stayed off the center of the stage, choosing instead to let Mason address the assembled flight crews and maintenance staff directly. He told them plainly that aircraft rarely fail because of a single crack. They fail because too many people along the way were too afraid to say the word no when it mattered most. Amelia watched him speak with a kind of respect that had nothing left of the executive looking down at a hired contractor. It had become something closer to one person who had made a serious mistake looking at another who had quietly kept her from making an even worse one. The distance between them had not fully closed, but it had changed shape into something honest. In the final scene, the same jet, now fully repaired and independently certified, sat ready on the tarmac for its first flight since the incident. Mason signed the certification himself, not because anyone pressured him to, but because this time, after every inspection and every correction, the aircraft actually was safe. The story closed on the image of the torn contract from that afternoon, framed under glass in the new safety office at Langford Aviation, with a simple line printed beneath it reminding everyone who passed that no flight was ever worth more than a human life. Visitors to that office often paused in front of the frame without knowing the full story behind it, but the people who worked there understood exactly what it meant every time they walked past. It was not a trophy celebrating a scandal survived. It was a quiet promise renewed every single day that the next person who found a crack in the metal would never again have to choose between speaking the truth and keeping their livelihood. Somewhere in every workplace, there is a moment when doing the safe thing costs more than doing the easy thing, and the difference between those two choices can decide whether someone comes home at the end of the day. Mason Carter lost a contract, a paycheck, and months of stability, but he never lost the one thing that mattered most to him, the certainty that he had told the truth when it counted. Amelia Langford lost a deal, a reputation, and a friend she trusted for years, but she gained something rarer than any merger could offer, a company finally built on honesty instead of fear. If this story reminded you why one honest voice can outweigh an entire empire of comfortable lies, carry that thought with you the next time silence feels like the easier choice.